Have you ever noticed how we talk about some things like they're just this sort of undifferentiated stuff?
Like what?
Well, like wine or wisdom or silverware.
Oh, yeah.
But then there are other things where it feels like we're talking about very distinct individual things, like a cat or an idea or an army.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. It's something we often take for granted in everyday language.
Right. And as a philosopher, it makes you wonder why language carves up the world this way, doesn't it? Like, what's the underlying difference? Why are some things mass and others count?
Well, you've hit upon a fascinating topic in the philosophy of language. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of these mass expressions, as they're often called.
Those wine, wisdom, silverware kind of words.
Exactly. And we'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide for this exploration. It's a great resource for unpacking the complexities of this seemingly simple linguistic distinction.
And for our listener, with your philosophical inclinations, this goes beyond just grammar, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is about getting to the heart of how we refer to things, what those things actually are, and even how we structure our understanding of reality itself.
I mean, it might sound a bit dry at first, like who cares about mass nouns? But trust me, this leads to some really deep philosophical waters, especially when you start thinking about ontology and the philosophy of language.
You're absolutely right. Our goal today is to really unpack these mass expressions, what makes them tick. We'll look at how they function grammatically, why it's so tricky to pin down their meaning, and then we'll delve into the different philosophical approaches for making sense of them.
So parts and wholes, sets, all that jazz.
Precisely. We'll even get into the fun stuff like how negation and quantification complicate the picture, and ultimately we'll consider what all of this tells us about how we use language to understand the world.
A pretty fundamental philosophical question when you think about it.
Absolutely.
All right, so first things first. What exactly are these mass expressions? How do we even know one when we see one? The Stanford entry starts with how to identify them, and it seems like syntax, the rules of grammar, is our most reliable tool, right?
Yeah, that's generally agreed upon. There are certain grammatical clues that point to a noun being a mass noun.
Okay, like what? What are the telltale signs?
Well, the traditional view is that mass nouns like milk or golds are invariable in number. You don't say milts or golds to refer to multiple instances, unlike, say, rabbits or bottles.
Right. And it's about the company they keep, too, the words we use with them. You say much water or a lot of furniture, but not one water or many furniture.
Exactly. So, dear listener, pay attention to the kinds of words that accompany a noun. If it plays well with much or a lot of, it's likely a mass noun. If it prefers numerical buddies like one or many, it's probably a count noun.
But of course, there are those pesky exceptions that always seem to crop up in language. The entry mentions how we sometimes use mass nouns in a count way, like, I might order a hot milk at a cafe.
Ah, yes. And we might talk about a lot of rabbit, meaning several rabbits. This sort of crossover can make things tricky.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, is a noun inherently mass or count, or does it depend on how we use it in a sentence, with different determiners and contexts?
Well, that's a debate among linguists and philosophers. Some, like Weinreich and Krifke, say the distinction is inherent to the nouns themselves. Others, like Damaret and Pion, Pelletier and Ware, argue it emerges from the noun phrase, the way we use the noun.
So like a chicken and eggs situation.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, is language reflecting how we perceive the world, or is it shaping our perception? A classic philosophical conundrum.
But for the sake of this deep dive, the entry sticks with the traditional view that nouns themselves can be categorized as mass or count.
Yes, it helps to simplify the discussion and allows us to focus on the semantic implications, what these words actually mean.
All right, so we've got the syntax down. Now, let's wade into the murky waters of semantics. How do we define the meaning of a mass noun? And from what I gather from the entry, it's not as straightforward as you might think. It's almost like the grammar is clearer than the concept itself.
Absolutely. There's been a lot of debate about the semantic properties that characterize mass nouns. Two of the most prominent ones are cumulative reference and distributive reference.
Okay, break those down for us.
So cumulative reference is the idea that if you have two separate things that are both M, where M is our mass noun, then the combination of those two things is also M.
So, like, if this is water and that is water, then together they're also water. Seems pretty basic.
Yes, very intuitive.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. Plural count nouns work the same way. If these are cats and those are cats, then together they're all cats.
So cumulative reference alone isn't enough to distinguish mass nouns, is it? It's like a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Precisely.
Yep.
Then there's distributive reference, which is the idea that if something is M, then any part of that thing is also M.
So if this puddle is water, then any drop from this puddle is also water.
Right. But this is where it starts to fall apart for many mass nouns. The entry gives the example of water being made of oxygen and hydrogen, but oxygen by itself isn't water.
Yeah, and a table leg isn't considered furniture in the same way a whole table is.
Exactly. So distributive reference doesn't hold up universally.
But didn't some philosophers try to salvage this idea of distributive reference?
They did. Bunt, for example, suggested that even if scientifically water isn't distributively referential, all the way down to the atomic level, we English speakers tend to act as if it's an everyday usage.
So it's more about how we use the language than some inherent property of the stuff itself.
That's the idea. But this kind of argument has its weaknesses. How do you test it? And does it really explain anything beyond just describing our linguistic habits?
Right. It's more descriptive than explanatory.
Exactly. And the entry also mentions attempts to redefine part in more nuanced ways within mereology, the study of parts and wholes. But even these attempts struggle to capture the full picture.
So it seems like finding a clean-cut semantic definition of mass nouns is a bit of a wild goose chase.
It is indeed. And the fact that the same noun can be mass in one language and count in another further emphasizes the role of syntax.
Yeah, like luggage in English is a mass noun, but baggage in French is a count noun.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if the underlying concept is the same, just expressed differently through grammar. And then you have languages like Mandarin, which don't mark singular and plural in the same way, which further muddies the waters.
It really highlights how language can both reflect and shape our understanding of the world.
Precisely. So for now, we'll acknowledge the challenges of pinning down a precise semantic definition and focus on the different philosophical approaches that try to make sense of mass expressions.
Sounds good. Let's dive into those. First up is the purely mereological approach. For a philosopher interested in ontology, this seems like a natural starting point, thinking about things in terms of their parts.
Right. This approach, advocated by Moravcsik, essentially equates a mass noun with the sum of all the stuff it refers to.
So water would be like the mega puddle of all water everywhere.
Exactly. It includes every single bit of water in the universe. It's a very inclusive view.
And when we say this is water, we're saying this bit of water is part of that giant sum.
Precisely. Predication becomes a matter of parthood. This bit is a part of the entirety of water.
Okay, seems straightforward enough. But the entry points out some pretty big snags with this approach, right?
Yes, it runs into problems, especially when you start thinking about those minimal parts we mentioned earlier. If water is just the sum of all water, what about a tiny drop of water? Or even the molecules that make up water? Are those still water?
And the entry uses the example of furniture. A chair leg is part of a chair, but is it furniture on its own?
Right. The mereological approach struggles to define those boundaries.
And then there's that famous wood furniture problem that Parsons brought up. It really gets at the heart of identity for a philosopher, doesn't it?
It does. Parsons imagined a scenario where all wood is made into furniture and vice versa. In that case, the sum of all wood would be identical to the sum of all furniture.
But we'd still want to be able to say that the furniture is heterogeneous, made of different pieces, while the wood might be homogeneous, especially if it's all the same kind of wood.
Exactly. So even if the sums are the same, the things they refer to can have different properties. That creates a problem for the purely mereological approach.
And the entry also touches on how this scenario gets into deep philosophical waters about the nature of identity. If we break down the furniture, the wood still exists, but the furniture doesn't. It makes you think about what really constitutes identity over time.
It does. And it highlights the limitations of equating language directly with the physical world.
Then, the entry mentions Moravcik's attempt to solve the minimal parts problem by saying that each mass noun has its own unique part of relation.
Right. So, being a furniture part of furniture is different from being a water part of water. It's an attempt to tailor the relationship to the specific noun.
But that creates a whole other problem for logic, doesn't it?
It does. If is part of changes meaning depending on the noun, then classic logical inferences break down.
Right.
Like, this is gold is metal, therefore this is metal.
Yeah, if being a gold part of something is different from being a metal part of something, then that inference doesn't necessarily hold.
Exactly. So, while Moravcsik tries to solve one problem, he creates another. And on top of all this, the purely Mariological approach doesn't really fit into a larger framework for understanding language as a whole.
Okay, so mereology has its issues. Let's move on to the next contender, the purely set theoretic approach. This seems to be a completely different way of looking at things. We're moving from parts and wholes to sets of individuals.
Right. Thinkers like Burge, Grandy, and Montague proposed this approach, which treats mass nouns as predicates that denote sets.
So water would be the set of all things that are water.
Precisely. And this is water would mean that this particular thing is a member of that set.
Okay, that avoids the whole minimal parts issue, right?
It does. The set of water simply includes all instances of water, however small they may be.
Sounds promising. But the entry points out a snag with definite descriptions like, the gold on the table weighs 50 grams.
Ah, yes. If the gold on the table just denotes a set, how do you assign a weight to a set? Sets don't have weights, individual objects do.
Right. It's like we're losing the sense of gold as a substance that you can measure.
Exactly. And then there's the classic philosophical problem of identity over time. The entry uses the example of clay.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. You have some clay on a desk one day, and the next day it's been rearranged into a different number of pieces on a table.
Right. And the question is, how can we say it's the same clay if the number of pieces has changed?
Sets are defined by their members, so changing the members usually means changing the set.
Precisely. So the set theoretic approach struggles to capture the idea that the same stuff can persist despite changes in its parts.
And the entry also mentions garbage, which is a tough one for sets because it's hard to even define what the individual members of the set would be.
Right. And for substances that can be infinitely divided, like water, the idea of sets of minimal parts becomes even more problematic.
So both the mereological and set theoretic approaches have their weaknesses. What's next?
Well, next up is the mixed set theoretic and mereological approach. As the name suggests, it tries to combine the best of both worlds.
Okay, so taking what works from both and hopefully ditching what doesn't?
Exactly. This approach suggests that while we can use sets to understand mass predication, the denotation of a mass noun might be better understood as a joined semilattice generated by the sum operation on portions of the stuff.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. So think of it like this. A regular set just contains individual bits of water. A joined semilattice allows us to also include all the possible combinations of those bits.
So, like, we can talk about some water and all that water and still understand them as referring to the same basic water stuff.
Exactly. The joined semilattice captures that cumulative aspect of mass nouns.
Okay, so how does this help with those problems we ran into earlier?
Well, for definite descriptions like the gold on the table, instead of denoting just a set, it denotes the sum of all the gold on the table. And that sum is a single entity to which we can ascribe properties like weight.
Ah, so we get that substance-like aspect back, even though we're still working with sets.
Right. And for identity over time, like with the clay, we're now talking about the sum of the clay, which can persist even as it's rearranged.
Makes sense. The stuff remains the same even if its configuration changes.
Exactly. And the truth conditions in this mixed approach are defined in a way that accommodates both the set membership aspect of predication and the mereological sums for handling properties and identity.
So we can still say this is water, meaning it's a member of the set of water, but we can also talk about properties of the sum of the water, like its weight.
Precisely. And this approach manages to stay within the familiar framework of set theory, which is a big plus for a lot of philosophers and logicians.
Sounds like a pretty neat solution, but of course, in philosophy, there's always another layer of complexity, right?
Always. The entry then brings up the challenge of negation, which is particularly tricky with mass nouns.
Why is that?
Well, think about the sentences. The gold is in the safe, and the gold is not in the safe. Now imagine a scenario where there are two pieces of gold, and only one of them is in the safe.
Okay, got it.
Intuitively, we'd want to say that one of those sentences is true and the other is false. But the mixed approach, at least initially, might not capture that.
Why not?
Because if the gold refers to the sum of both pieces and only one piece is in the safe, then the sum itself isn't entirely in the safe. So the first sentence might be false. But then the negation should be true, right? But how do we account for that semantically?
Yeah, it feels like there's a middle ground where part of the gold is safe and part isn't.
Exactly. And this has led to explorations of using Boolean algebra to handle negation with mass nouns.
Boolean algebra, like with truth values and sets and all that.
Right. But this approach often relies on the assumption that the predicates involved are homogeneous, meaning they apply cumulatively and distributively.
Like, if something is made by John, any part of it is also made by John.
Exactly. But we already saw that not all mass nouns and predicates work that way. Remember the furniture and the chair leg.
Right. So a solution to negation needs to work even for those non-homogeneous cases.
Precisely. The entry mentions another idea within the mixed approach, defining negation through non-overlap.
How does that work?
Basically, something is not P if it doesn't share any parts with the sum of everything that is P. So the gold outside the safe wouldn't overlap with the gold inside the safe.
Okay, but then the entry brings up those tricky predicates like cheap and costs 50 euros.
Right. Imagine two pieces of furniture that are each cheap individually, but together they're not cheap.
So their sum is not cheap, but the individual pieces overlap with that sum, even though they are cheap.
Exactly. So non-overlap doesn't solve all the problems either. It seems negation is a tough nut to crack, and it's not just an issue for mass nouns.
Yeah, the entry points out that even plurals and singular count nouns can have similar issues depending on the predicate.
Right. It suggests a deeper problem with how we understand predication and negation when things have internal structure, parts and wholes.
So negation adds another layer of complexity. And then there's the issue of quantifiers, those words like some, all, no, little, much, most, and those involving measurement like 2 liters of. How do those fit into the picture?
Well, Higginbotham and May applying ideas from generalized quantifier theory, which was developed for count nouns, to mass nouns.
So adapting the tools for cats to work for water.
Precisely. For basic quantifiers like some, all, no, and only, the truth conditions work similarly to count nouns. Some water is wet is true if the set of water and the set of wet things have some overlap.
Okay, it makes sense. But what about quantifiers that deal with quantity or intensity, like little and much?
For those, the idea is to introduce a measure function.
A function that does what exactly?
It measures the quantity or intensity of the mass noun. For water, it might be volume or weight. For wisdom, it might be something more abstract, like degree.
So little water could mean a small absolute volume, or it could mean a small proportion of the total water.
Exactly. And the context usually helps us figure out which interpretation is intended.
And most gold is found in mines would mean that the amount of gold in mines, according to this measure function, is more than half of all gold.
Precisely. And of course, things get even more complex when you combine these quantifiers with negation. Not much water isn't always the same as little water.
So quantifiers add a whole new dimension of complexity.
They do. And the choice of the measure function and its properties are also debated among philosophers.
So another layer of the onion peeled back. The entry then mentions logical relations. What does that have to do with mass nouns?
It's about making sure our semantic theories can account for basic logical inferences that we expect to hold true.
Okay, like what?
Well, a classic example is existential generalization. The wine is on the table. Therefore, some wine is on the table.
Right. Seems like a no-brainer.
It is. And the mixed approach we discussed seems to handle it well. If the sum of the wine is on the table, then there's definitely some overlap between the set of wine and the set of things on the table.
Then what about universal instantiation? Like, this is gold. All gold is metal, therefore this is metal.
Another classic. And again, the mixed approach seems to work. If this thing is part of the set of gold, and all gold is part of the set of metal, then this thing must also be part of the set of metal.
So it's about ensuring our semantics doesn't violate these fundamental logical principles.
Exactly. And the entry also mentions things like self-identity statements like all gold is gold, and instances like the gold in Zurich is gold, which should also come out as true in a sound semantic system.
Okay, so logical consistency is key. And the entry briefly touches on generic sentences like gold is metal and mass nouns used as count nouns like gold is a metal.
Right. A fully comprehensive semantics would need to address those as well. But that's a whole other deep dive.
Maybe for another episode. Now, let's move on to this intriguing topic of collective and non-collective construals and the idea of coverings.
Right. This gets at the flexibility of mass nouns and how their meaning can shift depending on the context.
Okay, give us an example.
Consider this sentence. This silverware costs 100 euros. It could mean the entire collection costs 100 euros.
Okay, the total price for all the pieces.
Right. Or it could mean each individual piece costs 100 euros.
Wow, that's a big difference in price.
It is. And it highlights how the same sentence can have different interpretations depending on how we're grouping or viewing the mass noun.
And the entry says that while mass nouns like silverware, where we can identify individual pieces, allow for both collective and distributive readings, this distinction might not always apply to all mass nouns.
Right. A mass noun like wine doesn't necessarily have those clear individual parts. It's more about whether we're talking about the wine as a whole or some unspecified quantity of it.
Okay, so sometimes it's more about collective versus non-collective interpretations.
Precisely. And the entry introduces this idea of coverings, which is even more general than just partitions or groupings.
Coverings, what are those?
Think of it like this. A covering of a set Y is another set X, where the elements of X add up to the same thing as the elements of Y, but they don't have to be completely separate. They can overlap.
Okay, so it's like a more flexible way of dividing things up.
Exactly. The entry gives the example, this livestock carried that furniture. Some pieces of furniture might have been carried by multiple animals. So the carrying relationship applies between elements of a covering of the livestock and a covering of the furniture.
So we're not just talking about individual pieces, but potentially overlapping groups.
Right. And this notion of coverings allows for a lot more flexibility in how we interpret sentences with mass nouns.
And it seems like it introduces a degree of ambiguity.
It does. Different coverings could lead to different truth values for the same sentence. So there's debate about whether such sentences are genuinely ambiguous or just indeterminate, meaning their exact interpretation depends on the context.
Another philosophical rabbit hole to go down.
Indeed. And finally, the entry explores the connection between mass nouns and plurals through the idea of non-singular terms.
Non-singular terms.
It's the idea that mass nouns, like plurals, might not actually refer to a single entity, like a mereological sum. Instead, they could refer to one or more individuals simultaneously.
So water wouldn't be the mega puddle, but rather a bunch of individual bits of water that we're treating as a collective.
Exactly. This approach avoids the need for minimal parts and offers a different way to understand the cumulative aspect of mass nouns.
And it seems to fit well with sentences like, the silverware comes from Italy, where we're clearly talking about multiple individual pieces.
Right. And Nicholas, who advocates for this approach, also argues that it can handle identity over time without relying on mereological sums.
How so?
Instead of the persistence of a sum, identity might be understood in terms of shared non-singular coverings. So in the clay example, the same bits of clay might exist in both the original arrangement and the rearranged one.
So it's about tracking the individual bits rather than the overall sum.
Exactly. And Nicholas even extends this idea to abstract mass nouns, like sadness and wisdom.
Wait, so even abstract things can be non-singular?
That's the argument. He suggests that abstract mass nouns can also refer to multiple instances of a property or relation.
Like Julie's wisdom would be all the instances of Julie being wise.
Precisely. And he argues that even abstract mass nouns can have those collective, distributive, and intermediate readings we discussed earlier.
So a unified account for both concrete and abstract mass nouns.
Exactly. It's a compelling idea that points towards a deeper commonality in how we use language to refer to both physical stuff and abstract concepts.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground. To recap for our philosophically inclined listener, we started with the syntactic clues that help us identify mass nouns and the difficulties in pinning down their meaning purely semantically. Then we explored the strengths and weaknesses of various philosophical approaches: mereology, set theory, the mixed approach, and finally the idea of non-singular terms. We also touched upon the complexities of negation, quantifiers, and the flexibility of collective and non-collective readings.
Indeed. We've seen how these seemingly simple grammatical distinctions open up a Pandora's box of philosophical questions about identity, predication, and even the nature of reality itself.
It really makes you think about how much is going on beneath the surface of our everyday language.
And as a philosopher, you can appreciate the profound implications of these linguistic nuances.
Absolutely. I mean, it makes you wonder, why is this mass count distinction so prevalent across languages? Is it just a quirk of grammar, or does it reflect something deeper about how we perceive the world?
A great question to ponder. Does it point to a fundamental distinction in how we categorize things? Or is it more about the flexibility of language to adapt to different ways of conceptualizing the world?
So much to think about.
There is. And we encourage you, our listener, to continue exploring this topic. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great resource, and there are many other fascinating works out there. As you encounter mass nouns in your own philosophical inquiries, consider the different approaches we've discussed. Reflect on the examples we've given and analyze other mass nouns you come across. The more you delve into this topic, the more you'll realize how much depth lies beneath the surface of these seemingly simple words.
Yeah, it's a reminder that philosophy is everywhere, even in the most mundane aspects of language.
Exactly. And by paying attention to these nuances, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep philosophizing.
And don't forget to pay attention to those mass nouns. They might just lead you to some unexpected philosophical insights.